The Tree and the Wedding, by Fyodor Dostoevsky. A few days ago I saw a wedding. But no! I had better tell you about a Christmas tree. The wedding was fine in its way, and it pleased me immensely, but the other episode was more interesting. It is difficult to say why, at the sight of the wedding, I recalled the tree. This is how it happened. Exactly 5 years ago, on New Year's Eve, I had been invited to a children's party. The personage who invited me was a well-known man of affairs, with many connections, a wide acquaintance, involved in intrigue. So it was quite natural to suppose that this children's party served as a mere pretext for the parents to crowd together and to discuss other interesting matters in what seemed like an innocent, accidental, and unpremeditated manner. I was an outsider. I had little to talk about, and I therefore passed the evening quite independently. There was another gentleman present, who was apparently of no particular importance, and who, like myself, had stumbled upon this domestic happiness. He, above all others, attracted my attention. He was a tall, spare figure, quite serious in aspect and very neat in dress. But it was evident that he was beyond joyousness and domestic happiness. Once he betook himself to a corner, he immediately ceased to smile, but frowned with his dense, black brows. Except for the host, he was unacquainted with a single soul at the party. It was apparent that he was terribly bored, and that he sustained bravely until the end the role of a totally diverted and happy individual. I learned later that this gentleman was from the provinces, and had a very important head-splitting affair to settle in the capital, that he had a letter of recommendation to our host, who was not at all disposed to treat its bearer con amore, and had invited him to the children's party merely out of politeness. He was not asked to join in a game of cards, nor to help himself to a cigar, and no one thought to enter into conversation with him. It was possible that the species of bird was recognized from a distance by its feathers. At any rate, our gentleman, at a loss what to do with his hands, found it necessary to stroke his side whiskers. The side whiskers were indeed very good ones, but he stroked them with such assiduity that to look at him it was quite natural to presume that the side whiskers came into the world first, and that the gentleman was attached to them afterwards that he might stroke them. Aside from this figure, participating after the manner described in the domestic happiness of the host, who had 5 well-fed boy youngsters, there was another gentleman who diverted me. He, however, was of a totally different character. In fact, a real personage. They called him Julian Mastakovich. The very first glance could have told you that he was a respected guest, and that his relation to the host was similar to the host's relation to the man who stroked his side whiskers. The host and the hostess showered compliments upon him, waited upon him, flattered him, conducted their guests into his presence for introduction, while him they did not conduct to any one else. I observed how a tear glistened in the host's eyes when Julian Mastakovich said that seldom had he spent so pleasant an evening. I experienced a disagreeable feeling before this person, and so after admiring the children I went into the small drawing-room, which was almost empty, and sat down in a kind of flowery arbor belonging to the hostess, and occupying almost half of the room. The children were incredibly charming, and seemed determined not to resemble their elders, notwithstanding all the efforts of their mothers and governesses. In a twinkling they bared the tree to its last bonbon, and had managed to break half of the playthings before they knew for whom they were designated. Especially fine to look at was a dark-eyed, curly-haired lad, who aimed at me continuously with his wooden gun. But, above all, my attention was attracted by his sister, a girl of 11 years, as lovely as Cupid, quiet, pensive, pale, with large, musing eyes slightly projecting out of their circles. The other children had somehow offended her. For that reason, she came into the very room where I sat, and betaking herself into a corner, was soon occupied with her doll. The guests looked with great deference in the direction of her father, a wealthy proprietor, and someone mentioned in a half-whisper that a dowry of 300,000 rubles had already been laid aside for her. I turned around to glance at those interested in this circumstance, and my gaze fell upon Julian Mastakovich, who, having thrust his hands behind him and inclined his head a trifle to the side, was listening with a marked intentness to the chatter of these folk. Afterward I could not help but feel astonished at the sageness of the host in distributing the children's gifts. The little girl who already had a dowry of 300,000 rubles received the most expensive doll. Then followed the other gifts, growing lower in value in proportion to the lower standing of the parents of these happy children. The last youngster, a boy of 10 years, meager, diminutive, freckled, and red-haired, received only a small volume of tales dealing with the bountifulness of nature, the joy of tears, and the like. The book contained no pictures, not even a decoration. He was the son of a poor widow, the governess of the host's children, and had a haunted, suppressed look. He was dressed in a wretched cotton jacket. Having received his book, he hovered for a long time around the toys. He had the most intense longing to play with the other children, but dared not. It was evident that he already felt and understood his position. It is a favorite occupation of mine to observe children. It is highly interesting to mark in them certain early and free inclinations of their natures. I noted how the red-haired boy was tempted by the expensive playthings of the other children, and especially by a toy theater, in which he showed a most eager desire to play some role, to such a degree that he adopted an ingratiating manner to attain his end. He smiled and joined the other children in their play, gave up his apple to one puffed-up youngster who already had a whole handkerchief full of gifts tied to his body, and even offered to carry another boy on his back, if only they would not drive him away from the theater. Soon, however, a bully in the party gave him a sound drubbing. The boy did not dare to cry out. Presently the governess, his mother, appeared, and ordered him not to interfere with the other children's play. The boy came into the room where the little girl was. She permitted him to join her, and the two of them were at once absorbed very earnestly in the rich doll. I had been sitting in the ivy bower a half-hour and had almost dozed off, while listening to the small chatter of the red-haired boy and the beauty with 300,000 rubles dowry, solicitous over the doll, when suddenly Julian Mastakovich walked into the room. He took advantage of a particularly disgraceful quarrel among the children to steal out of the reception-room. I had noticed that only a few moments before he was discussing very fervently with the father of the future rich bride, whose acquaintance he had only just made, the preeminence of one kind of service over another. At this instant he stood as if lost in thought, and seemed to be making a calculation of some sort upon his fingers. 300, he whispered. 11, 12, 13, 16, 5 years. Say, at 4%, 5 times 12 equals 60, at compound interest. Well, let us suppose in 5 years it ought to reach 400. Yes, that's it. But the rascal surely has it salted away at more than 4%. 8 or 10 is more likely. Well, let's say 500, 500,000 at the very least, not counting a few extra for rags, Having ended his calculation, he sneezed vigorously and moved to leave the room, when suddenly, his eye alighting upon the little girl, he stopped. He did not see me behind the vases of flowers. He seemed to me to be violently agitated. Either his calculation had upset him, or something else, but he did not know what to do with his hands, and was unable to remain on one spot. His agitation increased, ne plus ultra, when he stopped and threw another determined glance at the future bride. He was about to move forward, but first looked around. Then he approached the child on his tiptoes, as if conscious of guilt. Smiling, he bent over her and kissed her head, while she, not expecting this onslaught, cried out from fright. "What are you doing here, sweet child?" he asked in a whisper, glancing around him, and pinching the little girl's cheek. "We are playing." "Ah? With him?" Julian Mastakovich looked askew at the boy. "Go into the next room, like a nice little boy," he said to him. The boy was silent and gazed at him with perturbed eyes. Julian Mastakovich looked around once more and bent over the little girl. "And what have you, sweet child, a doll?" he asked. "Yes, a doll," answered the little girl, frowning and quailing visibly. "A doll. And do you know, sweet child, what the doll is made of?" "I don't know," answered the little girl in a whisper, lowering her head. "Of rags, my darling. And you, my boy, you had better go into the other room to your fellows," said Julian Mastakovich, as he looked severely at the youngster. The girl and the boy frowned and caught hold of each other. They did not wish to part. "And do you know why they gave you this doll?" asked Julian Mastakovich, lowering his voice more and more. "I don't know." "Because you have been a lovely and well-behaved child the entire week." At this juncture, Julian Mastakovich, agitated to the utmost, looked round and, lowering his tone to a whisper, asked finally in an almost inaudible voice, dying away more and more from agitation and impatience, "And will you love me, sweet girlie, when I shall come as a guest to your papa and mamma?" Having said this, Julian Mastakovich made one more effort to kiss the lovely child, but the red-haired boy, quick to see that she was at the point of tears, seized her hands and, out of deep sympathy for her, began to whimper. Julian Mastakovich became quite angry. "Begone, begone from here, begone!" he said to the boy. "Begone into the other room. Begone to your own fellows. No, don't go! Don't go! You had better go," said the young girl. "But leave him alone, leave him alone!" She was almost in tears. Presently there was a commotion just within the door. Julian Mastakovich immediately rose to his feet, somewhat frightened. The red-haired boy was even more frightened. He left his companion and stole out silently, with his hands brushing the wall, into the dining room. To hide his confusion, Julian Mastakovich followed him. He was as red as a lobster, and when he looked in the glass he seemed appalled as his own image. Perhaps he was annoyed at his rage and impatience. Perhaps the calculation he made earlier on his fingers had so affected him, tempting and inflaming him, that, notwithstanding his position and dignity, he was impelled to act like a young boy to attain his object, despite the fact that the object in any case could be attained only 5 years hence. I followed the esteemed gentleman into the dining room and witnessed a strange scene. Julian Mastakovich, his face all red from irritation and malice, was pursuing the red-haired boy, who, retreating farther and farther from him, did not know what to do with himself in his fright. "Begone with you! What are you doing here? Begone, you good-for-nothing! Begone! Stealing fruit, are you? Stealing fruit? Begone, good-for-nothing! Begone, unclean one! Begone, begone to the likes of yourself!" The frightened boy, driven to desperate measures, tried to get under the table. Then his pursuer, enraged to the last degree, drew out his long batiste handkerchief and lashed it out at the cowering boy. It is necessary to mention that Julian Mastakovich was a trifle fat. He was a satiated, red-cheeked, stoutish person, large at the waist and with fat legs. He was as round as a nut. He began to perspire, to pant, and to grow fearfully red. His fury knew no bounds, so great was his feeling of malice and, who knows, perhaps jealousy. I laughed out loud. Julian Mastakovich turned around, and in spite of his importance was covered with most abject confusion. At this instant the host entered by the opposite door. The boy climbed out from under the table and wiped his knees and elbows. Julian Mastakovich made haste to put his handkerchief, which he held by one corner, to his nose. The host, not without perplexity, surveyed the three of us, but like a man who understood life and looked at it with a serious eye, availed himself of the opportunity to speak to his guest alone. "This is the youngster," said he, pointing at the red-haired boy, "whom I had the pleasure of mentioning to you." "Ah," answered Julian Mastakovich, not yet fully recovered from his discomfiture. "He is the son of the governess of my children," continued the host in an appealing voice. "She is a poor woman, a widow, the wife of an honest official, and it is for this reason that—" "Julian Mastakovich, is it possible to—" "Oh, no, no!" Julian Mastakovich made haste to exclaim. "No, Philip Alexievich, I am sorry, but it is utterly impossible. There is no vacancy, and even if there were, there would be 10 candidates for the place, each having a greater right to it than he. It is a great pity, a great pity." "Yes, a pity," repeated the host. "He is such a modest, quiet lad. And quite a scamp, I should say," added Julian Mastakovich, his mouth hysterically athwart. "Begone, boy! Why are you standing there? Go to your equals!" At this point he could not restrain himself any longer, and looked at me with one eye. I too could not resist, and laughed straight in his face. Julian Mastakovich turned away immediately, and with sufficient distinctness for me to hear ask the host the identity of that strange young man. They exchanged whispers and left the room. I observed afterward how Julian Mastakovich, listening to the host, shook his head incredulously. Having laughed to my heart's content, I returned to the reception room. There the great man, surrounded by the fathers and the mothers of families, the host and the hostess, was speaking with great warmth to a lady to whom he had just been introduced. The lady held by her hand the little girl with whom only 10 minutes before he had made the scene. Now he was lavish in his praises and raptures over the beauty, talents, manners, and breeding of the lovely child. He was plainly playing the wheedler before the mother. She listened to him, almost with tears of joy in her eyes. The father's lips smiled. The prevailing spirit of goodwill rejoiced the heart of the host. Even all the guests lent a sympathetic hand, and made the children stop their games in order not to interfere with the conversation. The entire atmosphere was saturated with devotion. I heard later how the mother of the interesting little girl, touched to the very depths of her heart, begged Julian Mastakovich, in most effusive language, to do her the great honor of conferring on the house more often his precious presence. I heard with what undisguised joy Julian Mastakovich accepted the invitation, and how the guests, dispersing afterward in various directions as propriety demanded, exchanged with one another complimentary salutations regarding the host, the hostess, the little girl, and in particular Julian Mastakovich. "Is this gentleman married?" I asked almost aloud of an acquaintance who stood nearest to Julian Mastakovich. Julian Mastakovich threw at me a searching and malicious glance. "No," answered my acquaintance, mortified deeply at the awkwardness which I committed purposely. Not long ago I was passing the church, and I was astonished at the tremendous crowd that had gathered there. Every one talked about a wedding. It was a bleak day in late autumn. I made my way through the crowd and caught a glimpse of the bridegroom. He was a round, satiated, pot-bellied little person, very much adorned. He ran hither and thither, fussed, and gave orders. At last a murmur went through the crowd, announcing the arrival of the bride. I squeezed through the crowd and saw an astoundingly beautiful girl, who had hardly experienced the first bloom of spring. But the beautiful girl was pale and sad. She looked bewildered, and it seemed to me that her eyes were red from newly shed tears. The classic rigidity of her features imparted to her beauty a kind of dignity and strength. But through all this rigidity and dignity, through all this sadness, there penetrated the first aspect of childhood's innocence. It suggested something naive, fragile, and juvenile to the last degree, and though the look bespoke, page 31, resignation, it also seemed to utter a silent prayer for mercy. It was said in the crowd that she had just passed her 16th birthday. An intense scrutiny of the bridegroom suddenly revealed him to me as Julian Mastakovich, whom I had not seen for exactly 5 years. I looked at her. My God! I quickly made haste to leave the church. In the crowd they were telling each other how rich the bride was, that she had a dowry of 500,000 rubles, and so much besides in rags. At any rate, his calculation was a good one, I reflected, as I jostled my way into the street.